The vibration of my phone on the nightstand felt like an electric shock through the mattress. It was Murihai, Muriba that dead-of-night silence, where every creak of an old Victorian house sounds like a gunshot. I fumbled for the device, my eyes blurry and my head spinning with a familiar, heavy fog that had become my constant companion for the last few months. When I saw the caller ID, my heart did a painful stutter step against my ribs. It was Blake, my son. Blake didn't call at midnight. He was an FBI field agent stationed 3 states away, a man of rigid schedules and disciplined habits. If he was calling now, the world was ending. I swiped the screen with a trembling thumb, my voice coming out as a dry, raspy whisper. "Blake, son, what's wrong?" "Dad, don't say a word, just listen." His voice was a frantic, jagged edge I'd never heard before. It wasn't the voice of a federal agent, it was the voice of a terrified child. "I need you to get up right now. Do not turn on any lights. Do you hear me? Stay in the shadows. Get to the attic studio and lock the deadbolt. Do not, I repeat, do not let Lindsay or Cameron know you're awake. If they see you, it's over. Just go. Now." The line went dead. I sat there in the suffocating darkness of the master bedroom I'd shared with my wife, Helen, for nearly 40 years. My lungs felt like they were filled with wet sand. I wanted to tell myself he was overreacting, that the stress of his job had finally cracked him, but Blake wasn't the type to hallucinate. I looked toward the bedroom door. Down the hall, in the guest suite, my daughter Lindsay and her husband Cameron were sleeping. Or, at least, that's what I'd believed for the last 6 months. I'm Walter Reynolds. I'm 67 years old, and for most of my life, I've been an art restorer. I've spent 4 decades in the Hillrest neighborhood of Willowdale, hunched over canvases that the world had given up on. I know how to find the tiny, microscopic fractures in a masterpiece. I know how to spot the one brushstroke that doesn't belong. I spent my life fixing things that were broken, but as I stood up in that dark room, my knees popping in the silence, I realized I'd been blind to the rot spreading through the center of my own home. The fog hit me again, as I stood a dizzy, swirling sensation that made the floor feel like it was tilting. It had started shortly after Helen passed away from cancer 8 months ago. The grief had been a monster, eating me from the inside out, and when Lindsay showed up on my doorstep with suitcases and a look of angelic concern, I thought God had sent me a lifeline. "You shouldn't be alone, Dad," she'd told me that afternoon, sitting at the heavy oak kitchen table where she used to do her homework. "This house is too big. The memories are too heavy. Let us help you." I'd looked at her, my little girl, the one who used to sit on a tall stool in my studio and watch me bring 19th century landscapes back to life, and I saw only love. I didn't see the calculation in the way her husband, Cameron, was already measuring the crown molding with his eyes. I didn't notice how quickly they took over the mail, the bills, and eventually the medicine cabinet. I crept toward the door, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. Every step felt like an eternity. I passed the hallway mirror and caught a glimpse of myself in the moonlight, a ghost of the man I used to be. Thinner, paler, eyes sunken and confused. I looked like a victim. The realization stung worse than the dizziness. I reached the narrow, hidden staircase that led to the attic. It was a space Cameron hated. He said the fumes from the turpentine and varnish were unhealthy for a man of my age, but it was my sanctuary. I slipped inside, eased the door shut, and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. I sat at my workbench, surrounded by the skeletal remains of half-finished paintings and the sharp, grounding scent of linseed oil. I reached into an old dust-covered paint supply box and pulled out the prepaid phone Blake had slipped into my hand during his last visit. "Just in case, Dad," he'd whispered then. "The house feels different." I'd laughed him off. I'd told him he was being a paranoid cop. I'd told him his sister loved me. God, I was a fool. I turned on the tablet I used for my restoration work, the one synced to the small, hidden security cameras. I'd installed myself 2 weeks ago after I found the first white pill that didn't belong in my daily organizer. I'd been playing the part of the senile old man, nodding and smiling while I tucked their vitamins under my tongue and spat them out later. I thought I was being cautious. I didn't know I was in a race for my life. I pulled up the live feed for the living room. At first, it was just shadows, but then a light flickered on. It wasn't the main overhead. It was the dim glow of a flashlight. Lindsay and Cameron were standing by the fireplace, right beneath the life-sized portrait I'd painted of Helen 30 years ago. Cameron was holding a crowbar. He wasn't looking for a fall or a dizzy spell. He was prying up the floorboards behind the sofa, the spot where I kept the floor safe. "Is the ambulance confirmed for Bay?" "Hongye," Lindsay whispered. Her voice, usually so sweet and melodic, sounded like a serrated blade. "Confirmed," Cameron grunted, straining against the wood. "Russo signed the emergency commitment papers tonight. Once he's inside Evergreen, he's not coming out. The hallucinations we've been documenting will be enough to keep him sedated for months. By the time anyone asks questions, the house will be sold and the accounts emptied." Lindsay leaned against the mantel, her face illuminated by the flashlight. She didn't look sad. She didn't look conflicted. She looked bored. "I'm tired of the act, Cam. The worried daughter routine is exhausting. I just want the money." My blood turned to ice. Evergreen Behavioral Center. I'd heard the rumors about that place, a boutique psychiatric facility for the wealthy elderly that functioned more like a velvet-lined prison. Once you went in, your family took over your estate, and you were rarely seen again. I watched as Cameron pulled a thick manila envelope from my safe. He flipped through it my property deeds, my life insurance, the original copies of the trust Helen and I had built for our grandchildren. He tucked them into a bag as if they were nothing more than scrap paper. "What about the son?" Cameron asked. "Blake's been calling more often." "Blake is a 3-state-away problem," Lindsay said, dismissively. "By the time he realizes Dad isn't answering his phone, the mental break will be a matter of public record. He's FBI, he knows how hard it is to overturn a legal guardianship once it's in place. He'll yell, he'll threaten, and then he'll go back to his cases. He always does." I gripped the edge of my workbench so hard my knuckles turned white. They weren't just stealing my money. They were stealing my sanity, my reputation, and my very existence. They were turning me into a ghost while I was still breathing. I looked at the portrait of Helen on my screen. Her painted eyes seemed to be staring right at them, a silent witness to the betrayal. I had less than 7 hours before an ambulance arrived to haul me away to a place I'd never leave. Blake was too far away to get here physically in time to stop the legal machinery they'd set in motion. He could investigate, but he couldn't break the law. And Lindsay had played this perfectly. She'd spent months building a paper trail of my decline. I realized then that if I wanted to survive the night, I couldn't be the victim they thought I was. I couldn't be the confused old man who didn't know what year it was. I had to use the skills I'd spent 40 years honing. I had to look at the masterpiece of their lies and find the one crack that would bring the whole thing crumbling down. Suddenly, the floorboards below me creaked. Not the settling of an old house, but the deliberate, rhythmic sound of someone climbing the attic stairs. I froze. I hadn't heard them move toward the hallway. I looked back at the tablet screen. Cameron was still in the living room, but Lindsay was gone. The handle of the attic door turned. Slow, deliberate. Then, the sound of a key sliding into the lock, not my key, but a spare I didn't know existed. "Dad?" Lindsay's voice came through the wood, soft and dripping with that poisonous fake concern. "I saw the light under the door. Are you having another one of your episodes? You know you shouldn't be up here in the dark. It's not safe." I stared at the deadbolt. It was the only thing between me and the woman who wanted to bury me alive. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was thundering so loud I was sure she could hear it through the oak. "Dad, open the door. Cameron and I just want to help you." Then came a sound that made my hair stand on end. The sound of her weight leaning against the door and the metallic clack of the deadbolt being forced from the other side. She wasn't just checking on me. She was coming in to finish the job before the sun came up. I backed away toward the window, my hand landing on a heavy glass jar of mineral spirits. "I didn't want to do it this way, Dad." Her voice dropped an octave, losing all the warmth. "But you're making this very difficult." The door groaned as she threw her shoulder against it. I didn't know it yet, but the next 10 minutes would determine whether I spent the rest of my life in a padded cell or if I'd lived to see my daughter pay for every pill she'd ever forced down my throat. The door groaned, the wood protesting, as the spare key turned the cylinder. I barely had time to shove the prepaid phone into the depths of my apron pocket and scramble toward my easel. I grabbed a dry brush, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When the door finally swung open, I didn't look up. I stared at a half-finished landscape of the Willowdale Valley, my hand shaking as I made ghost strokes over the canvas. I let my jaw slacken. I let my eyes go glassy. I needed to be the man they thought I was. A broken, fading relic of a father. Dad, Lindsay's voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. I turned slowly, blinking as if the light from the hallway was blinding me. Helen, is that you? The light, it's so bright, sweetheart. I saw her flinch. For a split second, a flash of something guilt, maybe, or just pure irritation flickered across her face. She was dressed in silk pajamas, her hair perfectly tossed, looking every bit the grieving daughter. She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the workbench, the tablet, the corners of the shadows. My pulse was a deafening roar in my ears, but I held my vacant stare. It's Lindsay, Dad. Mom's gone, remember? She walked toward me, her hand reaching out to touch my shoulder. Her skin was cold. You're up here again, Dr. Russo said. The fumes are making your episodes worse. You're talking to yourself again. I was just looking for the cobalt blue, I mumbled, letting my voice trail off into a pathetic whimper. I can't find the blue, Lindsay. Everything is turning gray. She sighed, a sound of practiced exhaustion. That's because it's the middle of the night. Come on, let's get you back to bed. You have a big day tomorrow. A doctor is coming to see if we can help with these visions. She guided me out of the attic, her grip on my arm firm, a little too firm. As we descended the stairs, I caught a glimpse of Cameron standing in the shadows of the downstairs hallway. He was watching us, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of cold calculation. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The crowbar he'd been using earlier was gone, likely tucked back into his toolkit, but the floor safe downstairs was already empty. She tucked me into my bed like I was 6 years old instead of 67. She set a glass of water on the nightstand and placed a small, round white pill next to it. Take your vitamin, Dad. It'll help the dreams go away. I nodded, my eyes drooping. I waited until she closed the door and her footsteps faded down the hall. I took the pill, tucked it deep under my tongue, and waited 5 minutes before spitting it into a tissue and shoving it under my mattress. As I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind began to drift back. I needed to understand how I'd let this happen. I was a man who noticed the finest details, yet I had missed the total destruction of my own life. It had started with the funeral. Helen's passing had been a slow, agonizing slide into the dark. When she finally left, the silence in this house was deafening. I was a ghost haunting my own hallways. Lindsay had been there every day, crying on my shoulder, bringing over casseroles, telling me how much she missed her mother. She was my rock. And when she introduced me to Cameron Drake 6 months later, I wanted her to be happy so badly that I didn't look closely at the man standing beside her. Cameron was a real estate investment consultant, or so he said. He was 34, wore tailored suits even on weekends, and had a smile that felt like it had been practiced in a mirror. He was charming, attentive, and incredibly helpful. Walter, he'd said to me over a glass of scotch 2 weeks after they moved in, you've spent your life preserving the past. Let me help you secure your future. This house, your accounts, they're a lot to manage while you're grieving. I can take the burden off your shoulders. I'd felt a surge of gratitude. I was tired. I was so damn tired of being alone. I appreciate that, Cameron. I really do. That was the first fracture in the canvas. A month after they moved in, the subtle shifts began. It started with the mail. I'd go to the porch to get the morning paper and the bills, only to find the box already empty. I handled the utility bills, Dad, Lindsay would say, barely looking up from her laptop. And the bank statements. You seemed so stressed by the numbers last month, remember? You thought the electric bill was $10,000. I didn't remember that. I didn't remember being stressed by the numbers at all. But when your daughter tells you with tears in her eyes that you were screaming about the electric bill, you start to doubt your own reality. Then came the vitamins. The doctor prescribed these for your heart, Dad, Lindsay told me. And these others are for your memory. Willowdale is a small town, you know. Word gets around if the great Walter Reynolds starts losing his edge. We want to protect your reputation. The fog started 3 days after the first dose. At first, it was just a lingering drowsiness. I'd sit down to work on a 19th century Dutch floral piece and find myself staring at the same petal for 3 hours, my brush suspended in midair. Then came the gaps in time. I'd wake up in the kitchen with a sandwich in my hand and no memory of making it. You were wandering again last night, Walter. Cameron told me one morning, his voice low and concerned as he sipped coffee. You were in the backyard, digging in the flower beds with your bare hands. You said you were looking for Helen. I looked at my fingernails. They were clean, but Cameron pointed to a pair of muddy shoes by the back door, shoes I hadn't worn in years. I was. We're worried, Walter, really worried. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. They were building a cage out of my own doubts. And then, there was the incident with the missing heirloom. Helen had a brooch and emerald set in Victorian gold. It was her most prized possession, something she'd intended to pass down to Blake's daughter. One afternoon, I went to the jewelry box to hold it, just to feel a piece of her, and it was gone. When I asked Lindsay about it, she burst into tears. Dad, you sold it. 3 weeks ago, you told us you needed the money to buy more supplies for the studio. Don't you remember the man who came to the house? I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I didn't remember a man. I didn't remember selling the brooch. You were so insistent, Dad, Cameron added, placing a hand on my shoulder. We tried to stop you, but you got so angry. You said it was your house and your rules. That was the night I stopped taking the pills. I'd started to realize that the fog wasn't coming from my brain. It was coming from the little white rounds they gave me every night. I began cheeking, the medication hiding it under my tongue and spitting it out later. Within 48 hours, the world started to sharpen. The tilt in the floor leveled out. The gaps in my memory stopped. But as my mind cleared, the horror of my situation came into focus. I started watching them. I'd pretend to be asleep and listen to their hushed conversations in the kitchen. I'd pretend to be confused while I noted the way Cameron was moving my art collection out of the studio and into storage. Then, 2 weeks ago, I found the first piece of hard evidence. I was looking for a screwdriver in Cameron's office, the room that used to be Helen's sewing room, when I saw a folder labeled Evergreen. Inside was a brochure for the facility, but tucked behind it was a draft of a legal document, petition for involuntary commitment, and appointment of guardian. My name was at the top. The evidence of my insanity was a list of every lie they'd told me over the last 6 months. Patient experiences frequent hallucinations of deceased spouse. Patient is unable to manage finances, resulting in the sale of family heirlooms. Patient exhibits aggressive behavior toward caregivers. It was all there. A perfectly constructed trap. I lay there in my bed now, the moonlight carving deep shadows across the room. The ambulance would be here in a few hours. I had recorded their conversation tonight, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Lindsay and Cameron were smart. They had a Dr. Russo on their payroll. They had a paper trail of my dementia. I needed something bigger. I needed to know who else was involved, because as I'd watched them on the tablet earlier, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. When Cameron was prying up the floorboards, Lindsay wasn't just watching him. She was on her phone, typing furiously, and she looked happy. Not the cold, calculating look she gave Cameron, but something else, something private. I waited until I was sure they were asleep. I slid out of bed, my joints aching, and crept back toward the wardrobe where I'd hidden the tablet. I pulled up the saved footage from an hour ago. I zoomed in on Lindsay's face. She was smiling at her phone screen. She leaned in, whispering something to the device that the microphone barely caught. "Soon, Trevor," she whispered. "The old man is almost gone. Then it's just us." Trevor. The name hit me like a physical blow. I didn't know a Trevor. Cameron certainly wasn't Trevor. Who the hell was Trevor? And why was my daughter planning a life with him using my money? I realized then that this wasn't just a simple robbery. This was a double cross. Lindsay wasn't just betraying me. She was betraying her own husband. And if I could find out who Trevor was, I might have the leverage I needed to pit them against each other. But I didn't have much time. I went to my window and looked out at the street. A dark SUV was parked 2 houses down, its lights off, its engine idling. It wasn't an ambulance. The front door of the SUV opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a long coat, and he stood there for a long moment, staring up at my house, staring directly at the window of my bedroom. He didn't look like a doctor. He looked like a wolf, waiting for the sheep to be delivered. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Blake. "Dad, check the attic floor safe again. Not the one in the living room, the one behind the water heater. I found something on Cameron's tax returns. He's not who he says he is." I froze. I didn't even know there was a safe behind the water heater. I looked back out the window. The man in the long coat was walking toward my front porch. He had a key, and as he stepped into the light of the porch lamp, I realized with a jolt of pure terror that I recognized him. He wasn't a stranger. He was someone I'd trusted with my life's work for 20 years. What I saw next changed everything I thought I knew about why they were really doing this. The man standing under the amber glow of the porch light was Victor Ashford. For 20 years, Victor had been the premier art dealer in the tri-state area. He was the one who appraised the masterpieces I restored. He was the man who sat at my Thanksgiving table 3 years ago, praising Helen's stuffing and toasting to our eternal friendship. He was the gatekeeper to the high-end art world, a man of impeccable taste and, I thought, even more impeccable integrity. Seeing him there, holding a key to my front door and dressed like a common thief in the pre-dawn gloom, felt like a second death. It wasn't just my daughter and her husband. It was the entire ecosystem of my life, turning predatory. I watched through the hairline crack in the attic door as Victor stepped into the foyer. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He walked in like he owned the square footage. Cameron met him in the hallway, the two men shaking hands with a brief, businesslike nod. "You're early," Cameron whispered. "The buyer in Zurich wants the Vermeer copy and the Hudson River original on a plane by noon," Victor replied, his voice smooth and cultured, the same voice that had comforted me at Helen's wake. "I'm not leaving the provenance to chance." "Is the old man sedated?" "Lindsay's giving him a double dose of the sedative now," Cameron said, oblivious to the fact that I was currently staring at the back of his head from the landing above. "The ambulance will be here at Sao, Murlum. We moved it up. He's been getting restless. He almost caught Lindsay in the office yesterday." Victor let out a soft, dry chuckle. "Restless? He's 67, Cameron, not dead. Walter was always sharper than you gave him credit for. That's why we had to start the regimen early. If he'd stayed lucid, he'd have noticed the originals were being swapped for my forgeries months ago." I felt the floor drop out from under my feet. Swapped? They weren't just stealing my collection. They were replacing my life's work with fakes while I was too drugged to tell the difference. Victor wasn't just a thief. He was using my own studio, my own reputation, to launder forgeries into the international market. "Just get the crates from the basement," Lindsay's voice joined them. She had come down from the bedrooms. "I want him gone before the sun is fully up. I can't stand the way he looks at me anymore, like he's waiting for me to become the person he remembers." "Sentimentality is a luxury for people with less debt than you, Lindsay," Victor said, checking his watch. "Move. Now," Victor said. They headed toward the basement stairs. This was my only window. Blake's text was burning a hole in my pocket, the safe behind the water heater. I knew the utility room they were headed toward, but the water heater was tucked into a crawl space behind a false panel I'd forgotten existed. Helen had been the one who handled the emergency storage. She always said, "Walter, you're too trusting. You keep your heart on your sleeve and your money in the open. I need a place for the things that matter." I realized then that Helen hadn't just been being prepared. She had seen the rot in Lindsay long before I did. She had been protecting me from our own daughter. I waited until I heard the heavy thud of crates being moved in the basement, the sound of my life being packed away. I crept down the attic stairs, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I bypassed the second floor and slipped into the kitchen. The house felt alien, the shadows stretching out like grasping fingers. I moved toward the small utility closet off the mudroom. My hands were shaking so violently I had to grip my wrist to steady myself. I found the water heater, its pilot light casting a ghostly blue flicker against the copper pipes. I knelt, my knees groaning, and began feeling along the wood paneling behind the tank. My fingers caught on a recessed notch. I pulled, and the panel groaned open. There it was, a small, fireproof sentry safe. I didn't know the code. I stared at the keypad, my mind racing. I tried our anniversary, invalid. I tried Blake's birthday, invalid. I felt a sob rise in my throat. If I didn't get this open now, I'd never get another chance. I thought about Helen. What would she use? What was the one thing she never wanted me to forget? I punched in the date she was diagnosed. Somewhat high. Click. The door swung open. Inside weren't stacks of cash or gold bars. There was a single, thick manila envelope and a small digital recorder. I grabbed them and shoved them into the front of my trousers, the cold metal of the safe's contents biting into my skin. Just as I pushed the panel back into place, a shadow fell across the mudroom floor. "Dad?" It was Lindsay. She was standing in the doorway, a glass of water in one hand and a syringe in the other. Her eyes weren't the eyes of my daughter. They were the cold, flat eyes of a stranger. "What are you doing down here? You should be in bed." I scrambled to my feet, trying to hide the bulge of the envelope under my oversized sweater. I let my shoulder slump, my bottom lip trembling. I heard a noise, Helen. I thought the pipes were leaking. I didn't want the basement to flood again. "You remember the flood of Chinmuitam?" She stepped closer, the syringe glinting in the dim light. "There is no flood, Dad. You're having a delusion. You're agitated." "I'm not agitated," I said, my voice rising into a pitch of forced panic. "I just want my tools. I need to fix the leak." "Cameron," she shouted, not taking her eyes off me. "He's in the mudroom. He's having a breakdown." Footsteps thundered up the basement stairs. Cameron appeared, followed by Victor Ashford. Victor looked at me with a sickening expression of pity, the kind of look you give a dog that needs to be put down. "Walter, old friend," Victor said, stepping forward. "You look terrible. Let's get you sat down. The doctors are almost here." "I don't want doctors," I whimpered, backing away until I hit the washing machine. "I want my son. Where's Blake?" At the mention of Blake, Cameron and Victor exchanged a sharp, meaningful look. "Blake is busy, Walter," Victor said, "but don't worry. We've taken care of everything. We're going to a place where you can paint all day and never have to worry about a single bill again." Cameron moved in, his hands reaching for my shoulders. I felt the envelope shift against my stomach. If they searched me, I was dead. "Wait," I gasped, clutching my chest. I can't breathe. The medicine. I need the medicine." Lindsay stepped forward with the syringe. "This will help, Dad. It'll make the tightness go away." I knew what was in that needle. It wasn't a vitamin. It was a heavy-duty sedative, something that would knock me out for the next 12 hours, long enough for the ambulance to haul me to Evergreen and for Victor to vanish with the last of my originals. As the needle hovered inches from my arm, a loud, heavy bang echoed from the front of the house. It sounded like a battering ram hitting the oak door. "What the hell was that?" Cameron spun around. "Police!" a voice boomed from the foyer. "FBI, nobody move." Victor's face went from composed to skeletal in a heartbeat. "You idiot," he hissed at Cameron. "You said the sun wasn't a problem." "He isn't!" Cameron shouted, panicked. "He's in D.C." The distraction was all I needed. I shoved past Lindsay, knocking the syringe from her hand. It shattered on the tile floor, the clear liquid pooling in the grout. I scrambled toward the back door, but Cameron was faster. He grabbed the back of my sweater, hauling me off my feet. "You're not going anywhere, old man," he snarled, his face contorting into something demonic. The front door crashed open, and the sound of heavy boots flooded the hallway. I saw the red dot of a laser sight dance across the kitchen wall. "Drop him," a voice screamed. "Drop him now." Cameron didn't drop me. He swung me around, using my body as a shield, his arm locking around my throat. I struggled to breathe, the manila envelope digging into my ribs. "Stay back," Cameron yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'll kill him. I swear to God I'll snap his neck." I looked toward the kitchen archway. Blake was there, his service weapon drawn, his face a mask of cold, professional fury. But he wasn't alone. Standing behind him, with her hands zip-tied and her face bruised, was a woman I'd never seen before. "It's over, Kevin," Blake said, his voice low and dangerous. "Kevin? The woman behind me is the real Mrs. Drake," Blake continued, his eyes locked on Cameron. "The one you left for dead in a motel in Reno 3 years ago, after you cleaned out her retirement. We found Trevor, too. He's already talking." The grip on my throat loosened just a fraction as Cameron, or Kevin, or whoever this monster was stiffened. "Trevor?" Lindsay gasped from the corner, her voice trembling. "What do you mean you found Trevor?" "He's the one who gave us your offshore account numbers, Lindsay," Blake said, his gaze shifting to his sister with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "He was never going to Grand Cayman with you. He was planning to kill you both the second the art was on the plane." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs. Lindsay looked at Victor. Victor looked at the floor. The eternal friendship was dissolving in the light of the flashlights. But it was what happened next that truly destroyed me. Because as Blake moved in to make the arrest, I felt Cameron's hand slip from my throat to the waistband of my trousers. He felt the envelope. He didn't pull it out. He leaned into my ear, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee, and whispered the most terrifying thing I'd ever heard. "You think you've won, Walter? Check the last page of that envelope. You're not the only one Helen was keeping secrets from. He shoved me away and raised his hands, a sick, triumphant grin on his face, even as the officers tackled him to the floor. I sank to my knees, gasping for air, clutching the envelope to my chest. Blake was at my side in an instant, pulling me into a hug that smelled like home and gunpowder. "I've got you, Dad. It's over. I've got you." But as I looked at the three of them being led away in handcuffs, my daughter, my son-in-law, and my oldest friend, I knew it wasn't over. I pulled the manila envelope from my shirt. My hands shook as I opened the flap. I bypassed the deeds and the bank statements until I reached the very last page. It was a birth certificate. I stared at the names on the paper. I looked at the date. Then I looked at Blake, who was busy talking to a fellow agent. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my son, my daughter, and the woman I'd loved for 40 years was a lie. And the truth was far more dangerous than the men who had just tried to kill me. I sat on the edge of the gurney the paramedics had forced me onto, my legs dangling like a puppet with cut strings. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers strobed against the white siding of my house, turning my sanctuary into a crime scene. I watched as Blake, my brave, stoic son, directed the officers with a professional coolness that I'd always admired, but my eyes kept drifting back to the crumpled paper in my hand. The birth certificate didn't just have a name on it, it had a ghost. Trevor Sean Reynolds, born October 14th, 1992, the same day as Lindsay. The hospital was the same, the doctor was the same. But according to every memory I held dear, only one child had come home with us that autumn. Helen had told me, through tears that stayed with me for decades, that the twin brother had been stillborn. We'd grieved a shadow for 30 years. I'd visited a tiny, empty plot in the cemetery every Memorial Day, laying flowers for a boy I thought never drew a breath. But the document in my hand said otherwise. There was a footprint, a weight, a time of birth. Muimot, high PM, 6 minutes after Lindsay. "Dad, you're white as a sheet. Talk to me." Blake's hand was on my shoulder again. He looked so much like Helen in that moment, the same determined set of the jaw. I looked up at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt a wave of nausea looking at my own son. Did he know? Was I the only one in this family who lived in a world of fiction? I shoved the paper deep into my pocket, the secret burning against my thigh. I couldn't tell him yet, not while he was wearing that badge. Not while he was looking at me like I was a fragile piece of porcelain that might shatter if he spoke too loudly. I'm tired, Blake," I managed to say. "The medicine, I think it's finally wearing off. We're taking you to the hospital for a full tox screen," Blake said, his voice softening. "I want every drop of whatever they gave you documented for the prosecutor. I want them to rot, Dad. All of them." He looked toward the police cars where Lindsay was being mirrored in the glass, her face a mask of weeping desperation. She was screaming for me, her voice muffled by the windows, calling out for her daddy to tell them it was all a mistake. It was a performance that would have won her an Oscar if I hadn't seen her smiling at a crowbar an hour earlier. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I saw Victor Ashford being led out. He didn't look like a disgraced art dealer. He looked like a man who had simply lost a hand of poker. He caught my eye, and for a fleeting second, he smirked. It wasn't a smile of malice. It was a smile of recognition. He knew what was in my pocket. He'd probably known since the day it happened. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and the sharp sting of needles. They drew blood, they checked my vitals, and they gave me something to counteract the lingering sedatives. By tam, Hung A.M. The fog had lifted entirely, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity that was much harder to bear. I sat in a private room, the manila envelope resting on my lap like a ticking bomb. I waited until the nurse left before I opened the second part of the envelope, the digital recorder. It was an old-fashioned thing, the kind with a tiny cassette tape. I pressed play, my heart in my throat. Static hissed for a long moment. Then, Helen's voice filled the room. "Walter, if you're hearing this, it means the worst has happened. It means my daughter's heart finally turned to stone, and I wasn't there to stop it." Her voice was thin, recorded during those final weeks in hospice. I could hear the rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator in the background. "I've kept a secret, Walter. A terrible, selfish secret. I did it to protect you, because I knew you couldn't handle the truth of what our daughter really is. But looking at her now, seeing the way she looks at your paintings, the way she calculates the value of my life in insurance payouts, I realize I only protected a monster. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot and stinging. Lindsay didn't start this with Cameron, Helen's voice continued, hitching with a sob. She's been in contact with him for years. Her brother, Trevor. He didn't die, Walter. I gave him up. I saw something in him when he was born, a darkness I couldn't name. The doctors called it a lack of attachment, but I saw the way he looked at Lindsay, even in the nursery, like she was a tool. I was afraid, Walter. I was a young mother, and I was terrified. Victor Ashford helped me. He found a family for Trevor. He promised me the boy would be far away. The tape clicked, the silence of the room rushing back in like a flood. I stared at the wall, my mind spinning. Helen had given away our son because she was afraid. She had lied to me for 3 decades. And Victor, the man I'd shared my table with, had been the architect of the separation. But it got worse. The darkness, Helen saw, hadn't been cured by a new family. It had been nurtured. Trevor Mason. The man Lindsay was planning to run away with wasn't just her lover or her partner in crime. He was her twin brother. The incestuous, twisted nature of their plan made my stomach heave. They weren't just stealing my money. They were a duo of genetic sociopaths who had found each other across the gap of 30 years and decided to burn down the man who had raised one of them and abandoned the other. A knock at the door startled me. I shoved the recorder under the pillow just as Blake walked in. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes red-rimmed. Talk screen came back, Dad. Scopolamine and heavy doses of benzodiazepines. They were literally erasing your short-term memory every night. If we'd waited another week, the damage might have been permanent. He sat in the chair beside the bed, burying his face in his hands. I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. I'm an agent, for God's sake. I should have known she was capable of this. I looked at him, my son. The only real thing I had left. I realized in that moment that I couldn't tell him. If I told Blake that his mother had given away his twin, that she had been a liar, it would destroy the only memory of her he had left. He worshipped Helen. She was the reason he became a lawman. It's not your fault, Blake, I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. She's very good at what she does. The U.S. attorney is already moving on the indictments, Blake said, looking up. They're offering Cameron a plea if he turns on Victor and Lindsay. But here's the weird part, Dad. We can't find Trevor Mason. He vanished from the Riverside Hotel 10 minutes before the raid. It's like he knew we were coming. My heart stopped. Vanished? Yeah. He left everything. His clothes, his laptop. But the hard drive was wiped. The only thing he left behind was a note. It didn't have a name on it, just a single sentence. What did it say? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Blake pulled a plastic evidence bag from his pocket. Inside was a scrap of hotel stationery. In elegant, precise handwriting, it said, "You can't restore a canvas that was never meant to be painted." It was a direct insult to my profession. A message from a son to a father he'd never met. Trevor wasn't running away because he was scared. He was running because the game had just moved to the next level. "Blake," I said, my voice trembling as I reached for his hand. "I need to get out of here. I need to go to the studio. Dad, you need to rest. The doctors." "I don't need doctors. I need to see the paintings," I shouted, the first flash of real, unadulterated rage breaking through my composure. Victor said they were swapping them. I need to know what's left. What I didn't tell Blake was that I didn't care about the Vermeers or the Hudson River landscapes anymore. I remembered something Victor had said once, years ago, while he was drunk on expensive cognac. He'd joked that the best place to hide a masterpiece was under the paint of a common forgery. If Trevor was who the birth certificate said he was, and if Victor was his mentor, then they hadn't just been stealing from me, they had been using me. For 40 years I had been restoring paintings that Victor brought to me. I had been cleaning away layers of grime, unaware that I was working on the most stolen, most hunted pieces of art in the world. I was the world's greatest unwitting art launderer. We arrived back at the house late that afternoon. The police tape was still fluttering in the breeze. The house felt cold, even with the heating on. I walked straight to the basement, ignoring Blake's pleas to sit down. I went to the crates Victor had been moving. I grabbed a bottle of solvent and a cloth. I picked up a small, unassuming portrait of a merchant that Victor had found in an estate sale 5 years ago. I'd spent 6 months on it, carefully bringing out the colors of the man's velvet coat. I began to rub. Not the gentle, circular motion of a restorer, but the frantic, desperate scrubbing of a man looking for the truth. The velvet coat dissolved. The merchant's face smeared into a muddy brown, and underneath, emerging like a ghost from the fog, was a streak of brilliant, impossible blue. Ultramarine, lapis lazuli, a pigment that hadn't been used in that specific way since the 14th century. I fell back against the concrete wall, the cloth slipping from my fingers. It was a Vermeer, a real one that had been missing since the heist at the Gardner Museum in Motngin Chin Chum Chin Mui. I looked around the room at the dozens of other paintings stacked against the walls. How many of them were restorations I'd performed? How many billions of dollars in stolen history was sitting in my damp basement? And then, I heard the sound of the front door opening. Not the heavy, rhythmic tread of a police officer. It was the sound of a key, the same key Victor had used. "I knew you'd find it, Walter." A voice echoed down the stairs. It was smooth, cultured, and identical to the one I'd heard on the recording. "You always were a perfectionist. It's a shame, really. I was hoping to let you die thinking you were just a victim of a greedy daughter." I looked up. Standing at the top of the basement stairs was a man who looked exactly like the photos of me from 30 years ago. Trevor, my son. And he wasn't alone. He was holding a gun, and he was pointing it directly at Blake's head as he pushed him down the stairs. "Now," Trevor said, a cold, empty smile spreading across his face, "let's talk about the arrangement Helen made, because she didn't just give me away, Walter. She sold me, and I've come to collect the interest." The psychological tension in the room snapped like a dry twig. I realized then that the betrayal I'd uncovered was only the first layer. The real horror was just beginning, and this time, there were no FBI agents to save us. "Tell me, Walter," Trevor whispered, stepping into the dim light of the basement. "Which one do you love more, the son who stayed, or the one you forgot existed?" The air in the basement was thick, with the scent of turpentine and the metallic tang of fear. Trevor stood at the foot of the stairs, the gun steady in his hand, his eyes tracking between me and Blake. Seeing the two of them together was like looking at a fractured mirror. Blake, with his short-cropped hair and the weary lines of a man who believed in the law, and Trevor, who possessed my same high cheekbones and deep-set eyes, but with a gaze that felt as cold as a marble statue. "Let him go, Trevor," I said, my voice cracking. I was still kneeling by the Vermeer, the solvent-soaked cloth trembling in my hand. "This is between you and me." He didn't know. None of us knew. Trevor let out a soft, melodic laugh that chilled me to the bone. "Oh, Walter, you're still trying to paint over the cracks, aren't you? Always the restorer. You think if you just use the right solvent, you can melt away 30 years of lies and go back to being the happy little family in the big Victorian house." He shoved Blake forward. My son stumbled, his hands zip-tied behind his back. There was a dark bruise forming on his temple where Trevor must have pistol-whipped him. Blake looked at me, and for the first time in his adult life, the FBI agent was gone. He was just a son, terrified for his father. "Don't listen to him, Dad." Blake gasped, coughing as the dust from the basement floor kicked up. "He's got nothing. The backup is on the way. He's just talking to buy time." "Backup?" Trevor smiled, a slow, predatory expression. "You mean the 2 officers I diverted to the old mill with a fake officer down call on your own radio?" "No one is coming, Blake. We're all alone in the cellar, just like the paintings." Trevor kicked a crate of restored canvases. Victor Ashford was a genius in his own way. He realized that the world's most famous missing masterpieces were useless if they were recognizable. You can't sell a stolen Vermeer to a museum, but you can sell a newly discovered 14th century portrait to a private collector in Dubai. And if that portrait happens to be painted over a billion-dollar heist piece, well, that's just smart business. He pointed the gun at the blue streak I'd uncovered on the canvas. "You've been doing his dirty work for 40 years, Walter. Every time you cleaned a painting for Victor, you were actually helping him prepare a fresh layer of forgery to hide the truth. You were the most effective laundry machine in history. And you did it for the price of a few nice dinners and a Christmas card." The humiliation burned worse than the betrayal. I had spent my life thinking I was preserving history. Instead, I had been the one burying it. Every brushstroke I'd made to restore those pieces had been a nail in the coffin of the truth. "Why?" I whispered. "Why did Helen do it?" Trevor's face darkened, the playfulness vanishing. He stepped closer, the barrel of the gun now inches from my forehead. "You really don't get it, do you? You were the struggling artist. The man who cared more about the light on a pedal than the mortgage on the house. Helen was drowning, Walter. She was 18 months into a mortgage we couldn't afford, with 2 kids on the way and a husband who thought provision was something other people did. He leaned in, his voice a low, venomous hiss. She owed Victor Ashford money. A lot of it. Her father had gambled away the family's small fortune, and Victor held the notes. When the twins came, Victor offered her a deal. He needed a way to move the Gardner heist pieces. He needed a tame restorer. And he needed a protege, someone he could mold from birth to handle the logistics of the trade. She didn't sell you, I sobbed, the words tasting like ash. She couldn't have. She didn't just sell me, Walter. She selected me, Trevor said, his eyes gleaming with a manic light. She kept the girl because she was easy. She kept the other boy because he looked like a good son. But me? She saw the fire. She saw the side of her that was willing to do whatever it took to survive. She gave me to Victor to settle the debt, and to ensure that you would have a steady stream of work for the rest of your life. My life bought your career, Walter. My absence paid for this house. I looked at Blake. He was staring at Trevor with a mixture of horror and realization. The professional mask had shattered completely. She told me. She told me you were a stillborn, Trevor. We have a grave for you. A grave for an empty box, Trevor spat. While I was being raised in a series of boarding schools and consultancy firms, learning how to manipulate markets and people like you, Victor was a better father than you ever would have been, Walter. He taught me that everything has a price, even love, especially love. Trevor moved the gun back to Blake. And now, the price of my silence is the collection. Victor is in custody, and he's going to talk. He's old and weak, but I'm not. I'm going to take these paintings. I'm going to vanish, and you two are going to stay here and explain to the world why the FBI agent's father is the biggest art thief in history. He gestured to the crates. Start packing them, Walter. If I see a single scratch on that Vermeer, I'll put a bullet in Blake's knee, and then I'll do the other one. I want them crated and ready to move in 20 minutes. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I moved toward the crates, my mind racing. I was a man of fine details, of chemistry and light. I knew this basement better than anyone. I knew where the old furnace vents led. I knew which floorboards were rotted. And I knew that in the corner, behind the stack of old frames, was a gallon of high-grade industrial solvent I'd bought for a job that never happened. It was highly flammable and incredibly volatile. As I reached for a roll of packing tape, I caught Blake's eye. He saw me look at the solvent. He saw the flicker of a plan. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the heavy oak beam above Trevor's head. 20 minutes, Trevor, I said, my voice steadier now. But you should know something about that Vermeer. The solvent I used. It's reactive. If you move it now without neutralizing the pH, the paint will flake off in the crate. It'll be worth nothing but the canvas it's on. Trevor paused, his greed momentarily overriding his malice. What are you talking about? Victor said your process was stable. Victor isn't a restorer. He's a salesman, I said, taking a step toward the chemical shelf. I need to apply the fixative. It's in the back, behind the old boiler. If I don't do it, the light exposure from the basement windows will ruin the pigment before you even hit the highway. Trevor narrowed his eyes, the gun tracking my movement. Move slow. No tricks, Walter. I know how you think. You don't know anything about me, I whispered, reaching for the gallon jug. I gripped the handle of the solvent. I knew that if I did this, I might burn the house to the ground. I might destroy the billions of dollars in history that I'd spent 40 years protecting. But more importantly, I would be destroying the legacy of lies that Helen had built. I looked at the portrait of Helen upstairs in my mind. She had been the love of my life. She had been my North Star, and she had been a monster who sold her own flesh and blood to keep a roof over my head. I pulled the jug down. But as I did, Trevor's phone buzzed. He glanced at it for a fraction of a second, a mistake he'd never made before. Lindsay, he muttered, his thumb swiping the screen. I didn't wait. I swung the heavy jug of solvent with everything I had, but I didn't swing it at Trevor. I swung it at the old, cast-iron wood stove in the corner that we used for heat in the winter. The pilot light was always on. The jug shattered against the iron. A wall of blue flame erupted instantly, a roar of heat that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Trevor screamed, shielding his face as the fire raced across the solvent-slicked floor. Blake didn't hesitate. He used the momentary chaos to throw his entire body weight into Trevor's midsection, tackling him into the crates of stolen art. The basement was becoming a furnace. The old wood of the house, dried by a century of seasons, began to catch. I scrambled toward Blake, my hands fumbling for the zip ties on his wrists. "Go, Dad! Get out!" Blake yelled over the roar of the fire. "I'm not leaving you." I found a pair of heavy-duty shears on the workbench and hacked at the plastic. Blake's hands came free just as Trevor surged up from the pile of paintings, his face blistered by the heat, his eyes filled with a terrifying, nihilistic rage. He didn't grab the gun, it had been knocked into the flames. Instead, he grabbed a jagged piece of a broken frame and lunged at us. We scrambled for the stairs, the smoke turning the air into a thick, black soup. We reached the top and slammed the basement door, bolting it just as Trevor's body hit the other side. We ran for the front door, the house groaning as the fire began to climb through the walls. We burst out onto the front porch, the cool night air hitting us like a physical blessing. We collapsed onto the grass, coughing, our lungs burning. I looked back at the house. The Victorian lady, the place where I'd raised my children and loved my wife, was glowing from within. Flames began to lick at the windows of the living room, devouring the crown molding and the lace curtains. And then, I saw her. Lindsay was standing by the gate, her face illuminated by the fire. She wasn't in handcuffs, she wasn't with the police. She was holding a car key, and she was looking at the burning house with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. "Did you get them?" she screamed over the roar of the fire. "Trevor, did you get the Vermeer?" She hadn't even noticed Blake and me on the lawn. She was looking for her brother. She was looking for her ticket to a new life. Blake stood up, his legs shaking, his badge glinting in the firelight. "Lindsay." She spun around, her face dropping. The shock lasted only a second before she turned to run toward the dark SUV idling in the street. "Stay there," Blake shouted, starting to give chase. But Lindsay didn't stop. She dove into the driver's seat and slammed the door. As she shifted into gear, the ground beneath the SUV seemed to shudder. I realized too late. The old well. The house sat on an ancient property, with a forgotten well system that had been capped decades ago. The heat from the basement fire, combined with the weight of the heavy SUV, was more than the rotted wooden cap could handle. The back of the SUV dipped suddenly. Then, with a horrific sound of rending metal and collapsing earth, the vehicle vanished into the ground. "Lindsay!" I screamed, running toward the hole. I reached the edge of the sinkhole. The SUV was wedged 20 feet down, nose up, the headlights cutting twin beams into the dark earth. Lindsay was screaming, her hands clawing at the glass of the windshield. But as I looked down, I saw something else. Water. The old well wasn't dry. The pressure from the collapsing basement had ruptured the main line, and the hole was filling with icy, subterranean water at an incredible rate. "Dad, help me!" she shrieked. I looked at Blake. He was already on his phone, calling for a rescue team, but I knew the truth. Willowdale was 20 minutes away. The water was rising inches every second. And then, a hand reached out from the shadows behind me, a hand that was charred and bloody. "It's a beautiful ending, isn't it, Walter?" I turned. Trevor had escaped the basement through the coal chute. He was leaning against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps, watching his sister drown in the earth. He wasn't trying to save her. He was smiling. "One twin in the fire, one in the water," Trevor whispered, his voice failing, just like the secret she kept, perfectly balanced. He slumped against the trunk, the life fading from his eyes. He had spent his entire existence as a forgery of a son, and he was dying in the ruins of the house that had been bought with his life. I looked back into the hole. The water was at Lindsay's chin. She looked up at me, and for one fleeting, agonizing second, I saw the little girl who used to sit on the tall stool in my studio. "Daddy," she mouthed through the glass. I reached out, my hand grazing the cold air above the pit. I wanted to jump. I wanted to save her. But Blake's arms were around my waist, pulling me back as the edges of the sinkhole began to crumble further. "It's too late, Dad. The ground is unstable. You'll go down with her." I watched as the water covered her face. I watched as the light in the SUV's cabin flickered and died. The silence that followed was louder than the fire. I sat on the grass, my home burning behind me, and my daughter buried in the earth in front of me. I was the great restorer, but I was looking at a masterpiece that had been torn into 1,000 pieces. But as the first fire truck wailed in the distance, I felt something heavy in my pocket. I reached in and pulled out the small digital recorder. I had saved it. I realized then that Trevor's final words hadn't been a taunt. They had been a clue. I pressed play on the recorder again, skipping past Helen's confession, searching for the very end of the tape. There was a faint clicking sound, then a few seconds of muffled noise, like the recorder had been dropped into a bag. And then, a voice I hadn't heard in 30 years. A man's voice, cold, professional, and familiar. "The exchange is complete, Helen. The boy is gone. But you should know, Victor isn't the one who wanted him. He's just the broker." "Then who?" Helen's voice asked, trembling. "The man who really owns this town, Helen. The man who's been watching Walter since he was a student in Florence. The man who's going to make sure your husband never lacks for work again." The tape ended. I looked at Blake, who was watching the fireman arrive. He didn't hear the tape. He didn't know. I looked at the name on the brass plate of the mailbox that was still standing near the gate. It wasn't my name. It was the name of the man who owned the bank, the local paper, and the very land the house was built on. A man I had called my mentor for 40 years. I didn't know it yet, but the fire wasn't the end of the story. It was just the removal of the top layer of paint. The real masterpiece, the one that had controlled my life since the day I was born, was finally beginning to show through. And the next thing I found in the ruins of the house would change the history of Willowdale forever. The smell of wet ash is unlike anything else in the world. It's heavy, cloying, and it sticks to the back of your throat like a physical memory of everything you've lost. As the sun began to crawl over the horizon, turning the smoke-filled sky into a bruised purple, I sat on the bumper of an ambulance and watched the remains of my life smolder. The firefighters had finally stopped the active flames, leaving behind a skeletal ruin of blackened timber and twisted metal. The Victorian lady was dead. But the horror wasn't in the wood and plaster. It was in the 2 body bags being loaded into the back of a different van. One for Trevor, the son I'd never known, who had died with a smile on his face watching the world burn. One for Lindsay, my little girl, who had been swallowed by the earth and the water. I felt a strange, cold numbness spreading through my limbs. People talk about the heat of grief, but they're wrong. True grief is a deep freeze. It's an absolute zero that shuts down your heart to keep the rest of you from shattering. I looked at my hands, the hands of a master restorer, and saw they were stained with soot and the blue pigment of a stolen Vermeer. Blake was standing 20 yards away, talking to a group of men in dark windbreakers. The FBI had fully descended now. They were tape measuring the sinkhole and setting up portable lights to descend into what was left of the basement. He looked back at me once, his eyes hollowed out by exhaustion that no amount of sleep would ever fix. He was the only one left. And yet, looking at him, I felt a jagged shard of suspicion that I hated myself for. What else did he know? Was he truly the good son, or just the most patient one? "Mr. Reynolds," a young officer with a clipboard approached me, his voice soft with that practiced, gingerly tone people use around the newly broken. "We've cleared a path to the garage. It's the only structure that didn't take damage. Agent Reynolds said you might want to wait there while we process the site." I didn't answer. I just stood up and walked. The garage had been my secondary workspace, a place for the heavy lifting, the crating, and the storage of frames. It was cold and smelled of sawdust. I sat on a stool and pulled the digital recorder from my pocket. My thumb hovered over the play button. I needed to hear that voice again, the voice of the man who had brokered my son's life. The man who really owns this town, Helen. The man who's been watching Walter since he was a student in Florence. The words looped in my head like a skipping record. I closed my eyes and let my mind travel back 45 years. Florence. 1981. I was a penniless student, living on crusts of bread and the sheer awe of the Uffizi Gallery. I had the talent, but I didn't have the means. Until a scholarship arrived out of nowhere, the Vane Fellowship for Classical Preservation. It had been sponsored by Silas Vane. Silas was the patriarch of Willowdale. He owned the bank, the local newspaper, the timber mill, and half the commercial real estate in the county. He was the man who had shook my hand when I opened my first studio on Maple Street. He was the man who had sat on the board of the museum where I'd landed my biggest contracts. He was my mentor, my benefactor, my friend. I looked out the garage window at the ruins of the house. Silas Vane hadn't been helping me all those years. He'd been farming me. He'd found a talented, naive boy in Italy and brought him home to a town he owned like a private fiefdom. He'd ensured I stayed in debt by keeping the local economy under his thumb, and when the pressure got too high, he'd used Victor Ashford to help Helen settle the score. He'd turned my wife into a traitor and my children into pawns, all so he could have a world-class restorer who wouldn't ask questions about where the paintings came from. I wasn't a restorer. I was a high-end tool in a billion-dollar smuggling operation. The numbness in my chest began to crack, replaced by a slow, simmering heat. It wasn't the frantic rage I'd felt earlier. This was something different, something cold and analytical. The kind of focus you need when you're removing a century of grime from a delicate oil painting without destroying the original intent. I realized then that Silas Vane thought he had won. He thought the fire had cleaned the slate. Trevor was dead, Lindsay was dead, Victor was in custody and likely to be suicided before he could testify, and the stolen masterpieces were supposedly lost in the inferno. But Silas didn't know about the secret language. I stood up and walked to the back of the garage, where an old, heavy-duty metal filing cabinet sat under a tarp. This wasn't where I kept my business records. This was where I kept my practice boards, the samples I used to test chemical reactions before applying them to a client's work. I pulled out a drawer and found a stack of Polaroids. For 40 years, I had taken a photo of every painting Victor brought me before I started the work. I told him it was for insurance purposes. In reality, it was a habit I'd picked up in Florence. I flipped through the photos. Each one had a small, handwritten code on the back, a series of numbers and letters that noted the pigments I'd found and the layers I'd uncovered. I'd thought I was just being thorough. Now, I saw them for what they really were. A map of the Gardner Museum heist, the Louvre thefts of the Chine Mues, and a dozen missing private collections. Silas Vane had the paintings, but I had the ledger. I heard the garage door creak open. Blake walked in, his shoulders slumped. "The water's been pumped out of the well, Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "They found the SUV. It's bad." I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the Polaroids. "Did they find the paintings in the basement, Blake?" Most of the crates were incinerated. The heat was too intense. The FBI art crime team is saying the Vermeer is likely a total loss, carbonized. I finally turned to look at him. "And what does Silas Vane say?" Blake froze. The name hung in the air like a ghost. "What does Silas have to do with this?" "He was the one on the tape, Blake. The one who bought Trevor. The one who made sure I stayed in this house, working on those forgeries for 40 years. He's the architect." Blake shook his head, a look of genuine confusion crossing his face. "Dad, Silas Vane is 85 years old. He's in a wheelchair. He's the biggest philanthropist in the state. He gave $10 million to the Children's Hospital last month. He gave $10 million of my money." I snapped. "Money made from the blood of your brother and the soul of your sister. He's been laundering stolen history through my studio since before you were born. Dad, if you're right, if Silas is involved, we can't just walk into the police station. He is the police station. The chief of police is his nephew. The district attorney's first campaign was funded by Vane Timber." "I know," I said, a grim smile touching my lips. "That's why we're not going to the police." "Then what are we doing?" I held up the Polaroid of the Vermeer I'd started to uncover. "Silas thinks his collection is gone. He thinks the evidence burned. But he's a collector, Blake. A man like that can't stand to lose. He'll be desperate to know if anything survived. He'll want to see if the great Walter Reynolds can still perform one last miracle." I walked over to the workbench and picked up a clean, blank canvas. "I'm going to send him a message, not a text, not a phone call. I'm going to paint him a picture." Blake looked at me like I'd finally lost my mind. "Dad, you're exhausted. You're in shock." "I've never been more clear-headed in my life," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "He spent 40 years using me to hide the truth. Now, I'm going to use the truth to destroy him. But I need you to do something for me, Blake. Something that goes against everything they taught you at the academy." "What?" "I need you to tell the media that I've suffered a total mental collapse. Tell them I'm being moved to a private clinic for observation. Make sure Silas hears that I'm broken, confused, and most importantly, that I managed to save one single item from the fire before I lost my mind." "What item?" I reached into the back of the filing cabinet and pulled out a small, charred wooden box. It was empty, but it didn't matter. "The master key," I said. "Tell him I saved the master key to the collection. He'll know what it means, even if I don't." I didn't know it yet, but the master key wasn't a physical object. It was a bluff, a desperate, high-stakes gamble designed to draw the wolf out of his den. Silas Vane had spent a lifetime playing God with my family. Now, he was about to find out what happens when the man who knows how to fix everything decides to break it all down instead. As Blake left to make the calls, I sat at my easel. The sun was fully up now, shining through the garage windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I picked up a palette knife. I didn't start with blue. I started with red. The color of the fire, the color of the blood, the color of the revenge I was about to serve. What happened next was the beginning of the end for the Vane Empire. But before I could strike the final blow, a visitor arrived at the garage that I never expected to see again. A person who was supposed to be dead. I didn't hear a car pull up. In the silence of the scorched morning, the only sound should have been the settling of the ruins and the distant, muffled calls of the FBI technicians. But then, the side door of the garage, the one that always creaked, regardless of how much oil I put on the hinges, slid open with a heavy, familiar groan. I didn't turn around. I thought it was Blake. I thought he was coming back to tell me the media circus had begun, that the broken Walter Reynolds narrative was being broadcast to the greedy ears of Silas Vane. "The red isn't right, Walter," a voice said. The palette knife slipped from my hand, clattering onto the concrete floor. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It seemed to stop entirely, the blood in my veins turning to liquid nitrogen. It was a voice that had whispered to me in the dark for 40 years. A voice I had heard fading into a terminal rattle in a hospice bed 8 months ago. A voice that belonged 6 feet under the Willowdale soil. I turned my head slowly, my neck feeling like it was made of rusted gears. She was standing in the doorway, framed by the harsh morning light. She wasn't wearing the hospital gown I remembered. She was wearing a tailored navy coat. Her hair, which I had watched fall out in clumps during the chemo, was thick, silver, and perfectly styled. She looked healthy. She looked vibrant. She looked like a woman who had just returned from a long vacation, not from the grave. "Helen," I whispered, the word feeling like a piece of glass in my throat. "You always did struggle with the alizarin crimson," she said, stepping into the garage. She looked at the canvas on my easel, her eyes scanning the frantic red strokes I'd made. "It needs a touch of burnt umber to ground it. Otherwise, it's just noise." I backed away, my hip hitting the workbench, knocking over a jar of linseed oil. The smell filled the air, thick and nauseating. "You're dead." I watched the monitor. I felt your pulse stop. I buried you." Helen smiled. It was the same smile that had been my North Star, but now it looked like a carefully applied layer of glaze over a dark, unrecognizable portrait. "You saw what the doctors wanted you to see, Walter, and you felt what Silas Vane needed you to feel. Grief is the best blindfold in the world. Once you were mourning me, you stopped looking at the business. You stopped questioning the shipments. You became the perfect, grieving, distracted tool." "The cancer," I gasped. "Advanced stage theater," she replied, walking toward me with a grace that was chilling. "The hospice was a Vane property. The doctors were on the same payroll as Victor Ashford. I needed a way out, Walter. The walls were closing in. Trevor was getting restless. Lindsay was getting greedy. And Silas wanted a clean slate. So, I gave him one. I died, and the liabilities died with me." I looked at her, my mind screaming. The woman I had loved, the woman I had wept for every night for 8 months, had staged her own death to keep a criminal empire running. Every tear I'd shed had been a tribute to a lie. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of horror and a rising volcanic rage. "In a villa in Switzerland. Watching," she said. She reached out to touch my cheek, but I flinched away as if her hand were a red-hot iron. Her expression didn't change. "I saw what happened last night, Walter. I saw the fire. I saw what happened to our children." "Our children are dead," I screamed, the sound echoing off the metal walls. "Lindsay is in a hole in the ground. Trevor is a charcoal remains. And you're talking about color theory? They were casualties of their own incompetence," Helen said, her voice dropping into a cold, flat tone I'd never heard from her. "Lindsay was never meant to be a player. She was supposed to be the interface, the one who kept you managed. But she let her ego get in the way, and Trevor was always too much like Victor. He thought he could outmaneuver the man who created him." She looked at the charred box I'd pulled from the filing cabinet. "But you, Walter, you've surprised me. Silas is panicked. He thinks you saved the ledger. He thinks you have the master key." "Is that what you're here for?" I spat. "The master key. Does it even exist? Or is that just another fairy tale Silas told you to keep you in line?" Helen stepped closer, her eyes locking onto mine. "It exists. It's not a key, Walter. It's a series of high-resolution micro-scans hidden within the base layers of the paintings you restored. Every masterpiece Victor brought, you had a digital signature embedded in the lead white. Together, they formed the access codes to the Vane family's offshore holdings. Billions of dollars, Walter. Not just in art, but in the entire infrastructure of this state. She pointed to the Vermeer I had stripped down in the basement, the one I'd thought was lost in the fire. Silas thinks it's gone, but I know you. I know you couldn't let a Vermeer burn. You hid it, didn't you? You moved it before the fire got too hot. I stared at her, and in that moment, the last shred of my heart, the part that still held onto the memory of the good, Helen simply withered and died. She didn't care about our children. She didn't care about the 40 years we'd shared. She was here for the billions. She was Silas Vane's true partner. I didn't move it, I said, my voice as cold as hers. I watched it melt. I watched the master key turn into black smoke. There's nothing left, Helen. The empire is gone. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt. You're lying. You're a restorer. You protect things. It's in your nature. My nature changed when I saw my daughter drown because of the world you built, I said. Before she could respond, the garage door opened again. This time, it was Blake. He stopped dead when he saw Helen. His gun was out before his brain could even process what his eyes were seeing. Mom, he whispered, his face going ashen. What? How? Put the gun down, Blake, Helen said, her voice shifting back into that motherly, soothing tone. It's okay. I'm here. We're going to fix this. We're going to be a family again. She's the one, Blake, I said, not taking my eyes off her. She's the one who sold Trevor. She's the one who's been running Silas's books. She didn't die. She just retired. Blake's hand was shaking. The badge on his belt seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. I saw the death certificate. I saw the body in the casket. A waxwork from Victor's studio, I said. A masterpiece of a different kind. Helen looked at Blake, her expression one of heartbreaking pity. Blake, honey, your father is confused. The drugs Lindsay gave him, they've scrambled his mind. He's seeing ghosts. I had to go into hiding to protect you. Silas was threatening to kill you if I didn't cooperate. I did it for you. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was playing on his love, his grief, and his duty. I saw Blake's thumb move toward the safety on his weapon. He wanted to believe her. He wanted his mother back so badly that he was willing to ignore the charred ruins and the 2 body bags outside. Blake, listen to me, I said, stepping between him and Helen. She's here for the Vermeer. She doesn't care about us. Ask her about the bank accounts in Grand Cayman. Ask her why Trevor's note mentioned the canvas that was never meant to be painted. Blake, Helen whispered, taking a step toward him. Look at me. I'm your mother. I'm the woman who tucked you in. I'm the one who told you to be a hero. Would a monster do that? Yes, I said. A monster who wanted a hero in the family to keep the FBI away from her business. The tension in the garage was a physical weight. Blake looked from me to her, his world fracturing. He was an agent of the law, but he was a son first. Where is it, Blake? Helen asked, her voice turning sharp as she realized her time was running out. Your father said he saved something. The box. Where is the box? Blake looked at the empty wooden box on the workbench. It's right there. Helen lunged for it, her composure finally breaking. She grabbed the box and flipped it open. When she saw it was empty, a scream of pure, animalistic fury ripped from her throat. She turned on me, her face contorting into a mask of rage that removed any doubt about who she really was. Where is it, Walter? I'll burn what's left of your life to the ground if you don't give it to me. You already did, I said. I didn't know it yet, but I hadn't just saved a box. I had saved the one thing that could actually destroy Silas Vane and Helen once and for all. While they were busy looking for digital codes and microscans, they had forgotten the most basic rule of art. The truth isn't hidden in the paint, it's hidden in the frame. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small brass key I'd taken from Catherine Hayes. The master key isn't a digital code, Helen, I said. It's a location. A location you forgot about 30 years ago. The old schoolhouse on the Vane estate. The one where you used to meet Victor. Helen froze. Her face went from red to a sickly, translucent white. You couldn't know about that. I'm a restorer, Helen. I've spent 40 years looking at things other people miss. I found the journals you hid in the attic of the schoolhouse decades ago. I found the records of every child sold, every painting swapped, and every bribe paid. You're bluffing, she hissed. Am I? I looked at Blake. Blake, The schoolhouse. It's the second floor, behind the loose stone in the chimney. Go. Now. Blake didn't hesitate this time. He looked at the woman who claimed to be his mother, saw the greed and the rot behind her eyes, and he chose the truth. He turned and ran for his car. No, Helen screamed, reaching into her coat for a small silver pistol. But I was faster. I didn't have a gun, but I had 40 years of muscle memory. I grabbed the heavy glass jar of mineral spirits and smashed it against the workbench. The glass shattered, and I held the jagged edge toward her. It's over, Helen. The police are on their way to the schoolhouse. Silas is being arrested as we speak. You have nowhere to go. She stood there, the gun trembling in her hand, the smell of the ruins and the chemicals thick between us. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flash of the woman I'd married. I did it for us, Walter, she whispered. I did it so you could be the artist you were meant to be. No, I said, the tears finally coming. You did it for the red, the alizarin crimson. You just forgot that red is the color of the end, not the beginning. What happened next was the final reversal, the moment where the masterpiece was finally finished and the truth was laid bare for the world to see. But the final twist wasn't in the schoolhouse. It was in the one place I never thought to look. The jagged piece of glass in my hand felt heavier than any palette knife I'd ever held. I watched Helen's eyes, those beautiful, lying eyes, as they darted toward the empty wooden box, and then back to me. The silver pistol in her hand didn't shake. She was a professional. She was a masterpiece of deception, and I was just the man who had spent 40 years making sure her world looked pretty. The schoolhouse is empty, Helen, I said, my voice echoing in the cold garage. There are no journals. There is no loose stone in the chimney. She froze, her finger tightening on the trigger. What did you say? I sent Blake there to get him away from you, I said, a cold, hard satisfaction rising in my chest. I sent him there because I knew you couldn't resist the bait. You've spent so long chasing the master key that you forgot the man you were chasing it from. I'm a restorer, Helen. I know how to create a convincing fake. I gave you exactly what you wanted to see, a desperate old man with a secret. You're lying, she hissed, but her voice had lost its edge. You wouldn't put your son in danger. He isn't in danger. He's with his team. By now, they've already breached Silas Vane's estate. While you were standing here trying to squeeze a dead man for a digital code, the FBI was using the records I uploaded to the cloud 3 days ago to freeze every account Silas owns. The master key wasn't a code, Helen. It was the truth. And the truth is already in the hands of the U.S. attorney. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The gun lowered an inch, her face twisting into something ugly and raw. The silver hair, the tailored coat, the elegant poise, it all seemed to peel away, revealing the rotted canvas underneath. She wasn't the queen of Willowdale anymore. She was just a woman standing in a garage, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and her own failure. You ruined everything, she whispered. We could have had it all. The world, Walter. We were going to be untouchable. I already was untouchable, I said. I had a son who loved me. I had a daughter I thought was mine. I had a life built on work that meant something. You're the one who's broke, Helen. You've been broke since the day you sold your son to a man like Silas Vane. The sirens began in the distance, a low, mournful wail that grew louder with every second. Helen looked toward the garage door, her eyes wide with a frantic, cornered panic. She raised the pistol again, pointing it directly at my heart. I should have let the cancer take me, she said. The cancer was the only thing about you that was real, Helen, I replied, because it was the only thing that actually tried to end the lie. She didn't pull the trigger. Maybe there was a microscopic shred of the woman I'd loved left in there, or maybe she just realized that killing me wouldn't change the fact that her empire was ash. She turned and ran through the back door of the garage, disappearing into the dark woods that bordered the property. I didn't follow her. I didn't have to. Blake and his team were waiting on the other side of those woods. I sank onto the stool, the glass shard falling from my hand and shattering on the floor. I felt old. I felt like a painting that had been cleaned so many times there was nothing left but the bare, raw threads of the canvas. I sat there in the silence, listening to the sirens get closer, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing. Silas Vane was arrested 10 minutes later. They found him in his library, sitting in his wheelchair, surrounded by the stolen history he'd spent a lifetime collecting. He didn't go quietly. He tried to claim he was a victim of a rogue employee named Victor Ashford. But the ledgers I'd saved, the Polaroids, with the pigment codes and the backup phone recordings, were a mountain he couldn't climb over. He died in a hospital bed 2 weeks later, awaiting trial, his name stripped from the hospital wing and the timber mill. Helen was caught at the border. She'd tried to use a forged passport Victor had made for her years ago, but the FBI had already flagged her biometric data. When they caught her, she didn't say a word. She just looked at the cameras with that same, serene, amused expression she'd had in the portrait I'd painted of her 30 years ago. The aftermath was a long, slow process of uncovering the rot. The Willowdale, I'd known the quiet, safe town, was revealed to be a hollow shell, a company town built on the bones of stolen masterpieces and sold children. It took months for the FBI to sort through the basement ruins in the Vane estate. They found 42 missing masterpieces. The art world called it the miracle of Willowdale. I called it the burial ground. Blake stayed with me. We moved into a small apartment in the next town over, a place with white walls and no history. For a long time, we didn't talk about the night of the fire. We didn't talk about Lindsay or Trevor. We just existed in the same space, two men trying to remember how to be a father and a son without a script written by a monster. One afternoon, a year after the fire, I was sitting in my new studio, a small spare bedroom with a single easel. I was working on a small landscape, a simple study of the hills at sunset. No forgeries. No hidden codes, just paint on canvas. Blake walked in, holding a cardboard box. The lawyers finally cleared the last of the non-evidence items from the estate, Dad. They sent this over. He set the box on the floor. Inside were the few things that had survived the fire in the garage: my old brushes, a few jars of pigment, and a single, charred frame. I reached in and pulled out a small rectangular object wrapped in a silk scarf. I unwrapped it, and my breath caught. It was the emerald brooch, Helen's prized possession, the one Lindsay had told me I'd sold during one of my episodes. I held it in my palm, the green stone glinting in the afternoon sun. It wasn't a fake, it was the original. I realized then that Lindsay hadn't sold it. She'd kept it for herself, a final, tiny piece of her mother she couldn't bear to let go of, even while she was trying to kill me. She loved us, in her own twisted way, Blake said, his voice quiet. No, I said, looking at the brooch. She loved the idea of us. But love isn't something you can keep in a box, Blake. It's something you have to restore every single day. And some things are just too damaged to fix. I walked over to the window and looked out at the street. I saw a young couple walking a dog, the sun catching the gold of the autumn leaves. Life was moving on. The great Walter Reynolds was a footnote in a scandal, a man the papers called a victim of a decade-long conspiracy. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a man who had finally finished the most difficult restoration of his life. I had stripped away the lies, the grief, and the fake layers of my own identity. What was left wasn't a masterpiece. It was just an old man with a brush and a son who still called him Dad. I went back to my easel. I picked up a palette knife and mixed a small amount of alizarin crimson with a touch of burnt umber. "What are you painting, Grandpa?" a voice asked from the doorway. It was Emma, Blake's daughter. She was 9 now, with the same bright, curious eyes I'd seen in 100 portraits. She walked over and sat on the tall stool next to me, the same way her aunt used to do 30 years ago. "I'm painting the truth, sweetheart," I said, smiling at her. "Is it hard?" "The hardest thing in the world," I said, touching a drop of red to the canvas. "But once you see it, you can never look at a fake the same way again." I spent the rest of my years teaching. I didn't restore masterpieces for billionaires anymore. I taught kids how to see the light. I taught them that every painting has a story, and that the most important part of the story is the part that's hidden underneath the surface. I never heard from Helen again. She's serving a life sentence in a federal facility, a woman who lived for the red and found herself trapped in the gray. I don't hate her. Hate is a pigment that's too hard to wash out. I've moved on to the next canvas. My name is Walter Reynolds. I was an art restorer. I was a tool for a thief. I was a father to a monster and a hero. But today, as I watch the sunset over the hills, I'm just a man who knows that even the most broken life can be beautiful again, if you're brave enough to scrape away the lies and start over with a clean, white light. The revenge I took wasn't about blood or fire. It was about making sure the truth outlived the lie. And as I look at my granddaughter's smile, I know that the restoration is finally complete.